Howdy and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is the post-race reaction for the Italian GP or Monza GP race, if you like to know the actual track name. What was your thoughts of this race? Was it as exciting as the last one? Probably not, but did you think this lived up to the expectations of having a non-Red Bull lead the first 15 laps of this race? Did it have the interest overall, even though we had a nice battle between the Ferraris near the end of the race? In my view, the overall aspect of this race was a little bit dull. There wasn't as many passes or chances to do that throughout this race, and the strategy itself for the pits was kind of intermixed, even though you had the back of the field having to pit twice where the front of the field only pitted once. That strategy itself was not really enticing on trying to get the best positions. They kind of basically came out where they went back in. Even though it had a couple little minor things, it really didn't play a big difference in this race. But what was your thoughts of this race? Did you really enjoy this race? If so, please make a comment below. Or if you hated this race, make that comment as well. I would appreciate it very much. So, without further ado, I usually go through the drivers one by one, starting from the back of the pack to the front. And as I go through, I will start off with Yuki Tsunoda, who didn't even make it to the start of this race. Yeah, he was going around in the formation lap, and that AlphaTauri gave up on him, and he had to pull to the side. This caused lots of confusion at the beginning of this race, as they were trying to line up and they had a failed start, so they went around again, but that AlphaTauri was still on the side of the track because they couldn't get it in the right gear to get it pushed off the track, so they had to hoist it up on a truck and pull it in. And that caused some confusion as well because the lights on the start was messing up, and so when they came up to the grid the second time, all the engineers was trying to rush down to there to try to get those tire blankets and those engine coolers on those vehicles and try to just get those really prepped back up for the start of the race. And then there was no official announcement that they could get back on the race, immediately. And so they were all just bunched up, kind of gearing up. And then you had a couple of people jump the wall, and that was causing some confusion if they should be there or not. And they were kind of holding off, trying to see if what could go on. So that was the really excitement for the beginning of this race, was would we actually get a good start on this race to start off with? And that did actually happen. And so that was interesting in its own right. But then we have Esteban Ocon, who was the other DNF, and he went around quite a ways before he pulled off, but he did not actually make it in the running for most of this, so it wasn't a big loss for that Alpine. Then you had the two Haas's, which were having a horrible day. Their tires were just getting eaten up, and they were still having that back of the field where they were having to make 2 pit stops for this race, and they couldn't gain enough ground on their initial stints. So when they pitted, they were just getting pushed back farther and farther into this grid. So it wasn't a very good day for them. Kevin started off in 19th and actually made a position up to 18th, whereas Nico actually did a good job in qualifying and made it up to 13th in that Haas, but then couldn't hold on long enough on those tires and ended up dropping back into 17th. I know at one point they were looking see if there was a safety car or anything else that they could take advantage of, which never did happen. And so he just ended up in that back of the field along with his teammate. Again, we have Lance Stroll leading up the end of this with starting off at 20th position after he was struggling with free practice, not getting the feel for that car and not getting it lined up for his likings. So he ended up qualifying last, working his way up to 16th position overall. He did gain 1 position on the very start of the race, and I have him passing K-Mag on lap 4 for 18th. But we didn't see a whole lot from Lance, and with his teammate being up into that point positions, it's kind of a struggle for Lance to get anywhere near that with this DRS line and the straightaways that really had us struggling trying to get past people in that Aston Martin. Pierre Gasly qualified 17th and ended up in 15th. He did do a double pit stop and boxed at 11 and boxed at lap 32. Started off on mediums, going to a hard, and then back to the mediums. I don't have a whole lot written down for Pierre Gasly. I know he wasn't really happy with that Alpine in this, qualifying near the back of the pack instead of where he was last race. But he did a decent job with the way that Alpine was set up this week. And then we have Juan Yuzhou, who qualified 16th, worked his way up to 14th. He did gain 2 spots at the first of this start and basically stayed there for the rest of this race. So he didn't make a whole lot of positions, and he did fight a couple of those people at the very back of the packs as they were coming in for the pit stops and maintaining that position. But not a very exciting race for Juan Yuzhou. Logan Sargent qualified in 15th, worked his way up to 13th. He actually did have a 5-second penalty for causing a collision with Valtteri Bottas near the end, which pushed him back, or else he would have been a little bit farther up in the grid. Doing a little bit better in that Williams, but not as good as he probably should, as his teammate is racking up some decent points in that Williams this race. So it's kind of sad to see Logan in that back struggling, and with that drive option for this season not really signed yet for next. It really puts a lot of pressure on Logan Sargent in that Williams. He did gain 2 spots at the very beginning of this race, which was good to see. But overall, he just really didn't have enough in that Williams and that experience to really push forward, where he was trying to squeeze people out on those chicanes when he probably should have held back and let them go through, given them enough room or whatever to try to get them to run off the track, even though he was still valid, that they would have to drop back behind him once they made that position. So a little bit more experience on his end probably would have done him a lot of good in this. So it's hard to gauge him real strongly, but he's doing definitely better than he did last race. And I think he's just having a lot of pressure on him right now. So hopefully he can relax and just feel the car better in these upcoming races, even though they're not the European races that he's used to. So we'll have to keep an eye on him throughout this rest of the season and see if they decide to replace him or not. Then we have Oscar Piastri, who qualified in 7th and ended up in 12th. He was having a pretty bad day. He gained 1 position at the start. He boxed on lap 24 to switch from those mediums to hards. He had contact with Hamilton on lap 42 around turn 4 that caused some issues that he had to go back in and repit and change his front wing with. And so that made some issues. And then he had a 5-second penalty for running off the track for later. So he ended up getting a penalty that pushed him back farther in this grid. Kind of hard to say overall, because I think that hit with Hamilton really pushed him back because he had to pit for that front wing, which took a little bit longer. But I know he was up front trying to fight with his teammate in that, I guess, the back of the front pack, trying to get those last points, and just could not really get the feel for that McLaren this weekend, even though he ended up with the fastest lap after pitting on that lap 42. So he might have been a little bit ahead of that 12th position if he didn't have to make that last pit stop, even though his tires were running pretty ragged by that point in time. It's hard to say. I know he wasn't really satisfied with this race in his post-race interview with the way things went overall. But still, I think it's really good to see him as a rookie, really putting the pressure on his teammate throughout this race. So that's a good aspect of this. Then we get Liam Lawson, who actually I think did a really good job overall. Qualifying 12th, worked his way up to 11th, only the second time in this AlphaTauri, and only really good dry session that he's really been through a whole lot of. He had a standard race, nothing really too fancy about him, but he just being outside those points in that AlphaTauri think has made him a good showing for him overall. I was really impressed with him, even though we didn't see a whole lot from him in this race. We'll have to see how he handles these new upcoming races that, I don't necessarily know as well. And hopefully that he can shine in those as well. And we'll have to see when Daniel actually comes back in that AlphaTauri to take that seat back. So that is always an issue there too. But I think he did a pretty good showing what he can do while he had the chance. So I'm pretty impressed with Liam Lawson in that 11th position. This gets us to the top 10, where Valtteri Bottas qualified in 14th and made his way up into the points. I was actually really impressed with him. We didn't see a whole lot from him. I know he's one of those that actually started off on the hard tires and ended up boxing on lap 26 for those mediums, and was just able to work his way into that point position overall. Did a really good job, I think, in that Alfa Romero. It wasn't really that good, even though they had that livery that was painted up special for this race. Overall, the Alfa Romero was really struggling, and for him to actually get back up into that point position was a really good job for Valtteri. Hopefully he can shine for these last of the races, because I don't think he's really lived up to what he could do this first part of this season, leading that team. I think he's kind of struggled a lot in that. So it's really good to see him back into the points. And then we get Fernando Alonso, who qualified in 10th and made his way up to 9th. He did lose a position on the start of this race. He did have a issue with Hülkenberg on lap 8 for that 10th position, and was just kind of maintaining that position. He knew he didn't have the greatest car for this race, the way the circuit was laid out, but was able to just kind of lead everything together and get into some decent points for that Aston Martin, even though it wasn't where he really wanted to be, like he wanted to be on the podium. I think he realized fairly early that he wasn't going to be in that running for this GP race. So I think he did a good tactical race, even though we didn't see a whole lot from him in aspects of flashiness and whatever. This race, we didn't see that commentary from him on the radio as much either. But I think it's just a really good, steady race for him, getting points where he can. Always good to see Fernando in those point positions. Lando qualified 9th, ended up in 8th. Most of the time he was fighting with his teammate for the most of this race, going back and forth, trying to figure out where he was lining up, saying he was a little bit faster than Oscar when he was behind him, pitting, coming back in, just behind him, having that race out of the pits for that position. Kind of struggled behind Alex Albon, where that Williams was just really quick on the straights, and that McLaren just couldn't get that oomph that it needed to get up beside him enough in those braking zones to do a good pass. I know they battled it out quite a bit in those corners, getting pushed wide and having to come back and give the position back and try it all again several times. So I know they were having fun battling it out. But that McLaren just didn't have the oomph to really get past that Williams in this lineup. And I don't think it really had anything probably to do anything with those Mercedes either. So, I mean, even if he had made it past that Williams, I don't think he could have kept up with that Mercedes to actually put pressure on Lewis or George. So in that regard, I think he made most out of it that he could on that McLaren, and did a fairly good job, even though it wasn't really their race in this circuit. Then you have Alex Albon in that Williams, which did a phenomenal job, qualifying in 6th, highest ever qualifying, I think, for him, and making it up to 7th, or maybe that's what it was, the highest race finish for him in that Williams. So really excellent to see him in that Williams really put pressure and do those front line straight stretches, keeping those McLarens behind him. It's good to see that. And even though they didn't have the actual downforce in those corners to really do much, it was that straightaway speed was enough to keep them ahead of the McLarens. They tried to do some fighting with the Mercedes as they were coming by, but the Mercedes just had a little bit too much oomph for them, so they couldn't really hang with the Mercedes, but they did a great job keeping the McLarens behind them. So a very good race for Alex Albon, who ended up in 7th, in my opinion. Then we have Lewis Hamilton, the back of the Mercedes, which I thought was interesting that we had the Mercedes and then we had the Ferraris and then we had the Red Bulls to top up this race. So we had the 3 top constructors in this battle all lining up 1-2 for each other in this race. So I thought that was kind of interesting overall. And Lewis was that back of that pack. He didn't do really good in the qualifying, only qualifying 8th. Made it his way up to 6th. He did have a 5-second penalty for causing a collision, which he had to overtake and make up so that he didn't lose a position. So good for Lewis on that. I saw that he actually passed Alonso on lap 29 for that 9th position. He passed Lando on lap 45 for the 7th position, and he passed Albon on lap 47 for that 6th position. So he did a fair number of passes overall. He did have some contact with Oscar, which that's what gave him that 5-second penalty. But he was able to overcome that 5-second penalty to maintain the position that he ended up in at the end of this race. So a very good race for him, even though that Mercedes was not where he wanted it to be. I know he was really struggling throughout this weekend in that Mercedes, trying to get the most out of that. I know he was complaining to his engineers about the setup in that free practice too, and has had to work with it to try to get the most information out of that Mercedes so that he could get it planned for the race. Then we have George, who qualified in 4th and dropped back a position actually to 5th. I think he did a decent race. He did also get a 5-second penalty for running Ocon off the track when he probably shouldn't have, as he wasn't really fighting Ocon at the time. But then he got so far ahead that it wasn't really worth him giving that position back. So he just got the 5-second penalty, worked it through on this race to end up in that 5th position overall. So a decent race for him. I think it could have been a little bit better, a little bit cleaner for George. But coming through, I think he did Mercedes a really good job in that race, as they really couldn't keep up with the Ferraris or the Red Bulls in this stint. Then we have the 2 Ferraris. We have Charles Leclerc, who qualified in 3rd and ended up in 4th. Charles passed Hamilton on lap 27 for 3rd position, and then he was battling it out with his teammate for the end of this, going back and forth and really putting pressure on his teammate when his teammate's tires were running completely out. And his teammate was really trying to defend, keeping that podium position for that Ferrari. So there's a big battle in the Italian GP on those Ferraris to try to figure out who was going to be on that podium. I think he did a really good job overall in this race, even though he didn't really have a fight for those Red Bulls. I think they got most of what they could out of that Ferraris, even though they were battling it out, letting the Red Bulls a little bit farther ahead than they probably could have been. Getting George kind of back into that fight for that 3rd position potentially, but never did really happen overall. It was mainly a fight between those Ferraris. I think he did a good clean race, even though he kind of pushed his teammate a little bit in those final battle for that 3rd position. But good job for Charles Leclerc and the Ferraris overall, I think, in this race to have a good showing in their home race. Then we have Carlos Sainz, who qualified in 1st and ended up in 3rd. By looking at that standard, you might think, oh, this is a horrible race for Carlos, but it actually was a decent race for him. He was able to keep Max Verstappen in that 2nd position from the start of the race, which was a good job. And then he maintained that for 15 laps by defending pretty hard where Max was being able to steadily gain positions, push him, put pressure on him, and then end up making him make that little lockup mistake, which gave him what he needed to pass him for that overall first position at that start. They pulled him in, get back out in that second position, but they really didn't have the stint after fighting all of the people around him and his teammate to keep really Sergio behind him. And so he got past him, I guess it was around lap 47, but maintained that second position for a pretty long time during this race. So I think it was a really good stint for those Ferraris. And I think they did all they could in that Ferrari, considering the pace of that Red Bull that we've seen this season. Can we get that little bit more oomph out of those Ferraris for the rest of the season to actually put pressure on that, finishing the race? Potentially having a non-Red Bull finish a race would be fantastic. It's kind of hard to see that, predict that, at this stage in the season, as Max has been so dominant overall, and the Red Bulls themselves being pretty dominant over the rest of the constructors as well. So it's hard to see that, but I know we're getting to the end where they've already focused their, build towards the next season. So they're not really developing this chassis as much, but we'll have to wait and see if the Ferraris can really put any more pressure on those Red Bulls, or if they can keep ahead of the Mercedes throughout the rest of the season as well. Which leads us to the Red Bulls, who Sergio was in fifth after having some struggles and hitting the wall early on in this weekend, not getting the parts back in the correct order. Just that fine tuning gave him a fifth position in qualifying, so not quite where he wanted to be overall, but was able to fight his way back to that second position. I know he really struggled to get past those cars, just getting up alongside him, but not quite as much as he really needed to make the corner, then having to drop back and repeating those attempts, but finally was able to get that really pressure on and getting it up where he could make those passes. And then once he made that pass, he did a decent job of maintaining his pace behind Max, only dropping back about 6 seconds from the lead after all of it said and done from Max's position, which is fairly good considering where Max has been in the past, where leading by 20 seconds and whatnot at the end is. So I think it's a decent job for Sergio, even though he really wasn't comfortable in that Red Bull this weekend. Hopefully he can get a little bit more comfort and put a little bit more pressure on his teammate. And then, of course, we have Max, who was almost a flawless race. He didn't quite get pole position, but maintained that second position, put pressure immediately on Carlos Sainz, and was just patient and knew when the time was going to be right, and just pounced when that mistake was happening on Carlos to take that lead. And then he just maintained that fairly easily the rest of the race. I have that, he passed Hamilton on lap 25 for that first position because Carlos had pitted. And then he had a 5.6 second lead at lap 29 when everything got back in order. And he ended up 6 seconds ahead of his teammate at the end of the race. So pretty much a flawless victory for Max, and gaining that 10th victory in a row is fantastic. It's kind of awe-inspiring in the sense, as you don't know if anybody else is going to even come close anytime soon to actually getting the number of victories that I think he could have during this season, because it's hard to see that anybody but his teammate would actually put pressure on him for the rest of the season to actually take that first position. So unless something breaks during the race or somebody crashes him out, it's going to be hard for him not to win the rest of these races for this season. I think we really got shown that this past race, when the track conditions were changing from dry to wet and wet to dry, he just called those and was able to maintain that calm peace to actually take advantage of all those things. And even though he was slightly out of sync for the optimal pit strategy last race, he was still able to easily win that race. And this race was no exception. Even though he didn't make the pole, he followed along, just biding his time, not pushing, into a mistake that he would make and run himself off like he did with the Mercedes and Hamilton. So I think he's learned, he's matured, and I think there's going to be really hard to stop him for the rest of the season. But overall, I thought this was average race. Overall, you had some interesting developments near the front of the race with the Ferraris and with Sergio trying to work his way back up to that second position. But the rest of the field was pretty much there in that running. And so I didn't think this was the best race overall. I'd probably give it a 4 out of 5, maybe. Not quite the average, even though you could say some aspects were better than other races overall. I think it just needed a little bit more oomph for the rest of the field. And with Max, being the lead, you knew that he was just going to win. So that was my thoughts on the full race. So this leads us to the driver's standing. And the only driver's standings that really changed was the Ferrari driver. So Carlos Sainz, passed Charles Leclerc for that 5th position, ending up in 117 points. And we have Max, of course, leading the way with 364 points. So far ahead of the rest of the field. And we just have those little bit of battles behind him in the constructors' standings. You also have a little bit of movement that I didn't really mark, which was Liam Lawson on the official boards, moving up to that 20th position ahead of Nick DeVries and Daniel Ricciardo. But they have 0 points at this point in standing, even though Liam came close today for making that first point for his season. This leads us to the constructors' standing. So in the constructors' standing, you have Red Bull still leading the way with a fiberglass, phenomenal, 583 points. Whereas Mercedes is in second with 273. And then you have Ferrari moving into that third position with 228, with Aston Martin dropping back to fourth with 217. As Lance Stroll couldn't make points, and those Ferraris being 2-3, led them to pass the Aston Martins. So overall, what was your thoughts on the Monza race? As I said, I didn't think it was the greatest race, even though we had some pieces that were exciting. I don't think the overall race itself lent itself very well. Our next race is going to be in Singapore on September 17th. So we have a next weekend off, and then we follow up in Singapore at the Marina Bay. And I didn't have a whole lot of information on this, except that it's going to be 62 laps, and it was first introduced in 2008. And I have 208, so I have a typo there. So it will be a night race, and so it'll be under the lights, so that's always nice to see. Races under the lights, so you see the shine of those chassis as those drive under those lights for the track. Anyway, if you made it this far, I would appreciate a like. And if you want to see my thoughts on the Singapore race when it comes up, please subscribe. And until then, I will see you on the grid.